CEO of NourNet. NourNet is the digital enabler in Saudi Arabia, operating since 1990. We started from a semi-ICT to a full integrated ICT provider. We have built the first carrier-neutral enterprise data center in Saudi back in 2017, and we have been now evolving this and expanding it between regions. So, thank you. And I mean, without hesitations, I want to introduce my colleagues. Nishil, Stuart, I'll start with you. Please just do what you've been doing.
Certainly.
How's life?
Life is pretty good. Colm, Shorten, I work for JLL. I'm a specialist in data centers, over 35 years. Background is 10 years with Fujitsu, building semiconductors, 20 years with IBM, and now into year 5 with JLL. JLL cover end-to-end data center services and solutions across the region. We have some of our team here as well. If you have any difficult questions, please direct them at Aditya and Priyanka, Wave. And so basically I provide guidance either to fund, government, hyperscale or co-location providers, primarily on the technical side but also on strategic market entry. I'm looking forward to a healthy debate today with our colleagues on the panel.
Nishil?
Hi, good morning everyone. My name is Nishil, Dhanani, Director at DataVolt. My background spans lots of things. I'm an expert at nothing, to be fair. I joined DataVolt a little while ago. I've been in the data center industry for the last few years with a background on heavy infrastructure delivery. At DataVolt, still a very new company. We just passed 1 year, probably a few weeks ago. We're looking to assist the kingdom achieve 2030 goals to deliver hyperscale data centers in excess of 30 megawatts. My role specifically is to bring the background that I spent in Europe the last few years to help them meet that trajectory, but also understand and help with the regulation and the processes to work out here as well.
Good morning everyone, my name is Stuart Manby, I'm the Chief Sales Officer for Ezditek. Ezditek are delivering large-scale campuses here in Riyadh, Dhanani and Jeddah. We broke ground on our first facility at Princess Noura University just over 2 weeks ago, delivering 24 megawatts of IT. Our vision is in line with the 2030 Saudi vision, and that is to deliver, as I've said, large-scale carrier-neutral facilities to accommodate both hyperscale, wholesale, AI and enterprise within Saudi Arabia in the next 5 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stuart. So, I mean, moving forward to our discussions first, we're going to talk about the regulations, whatever is happening in Saudi Arabia. First, when we go into the regulations, I want to understand Saudi Arabia, some rules in general. I mean, just yes, one level. Bring these regulations closer to them to understand what's going on in terms of regulations for Saudi Arabia and just different
Yeah, sure. I think the whole area of regulations, particularly around data and cloud, are very complex, and we're actually on a journey. If we go back, from a Saudi standpoint, the kingdom first introduced back in 2020 Cloud First, and that was basically setting the scene for cloud service providers and how they should operate both on a physical security, cyber or data security, and a little bit more, we can touch on it later on, around sustainability, efficiency and effectiveness. What we're seeing now is under CST, Communication Science and Technology, in January 2024 we have now more stringent guidelines around security. And I see it also as this is not the end of it. It is a 3-year regulation that, when it's reviewed within the 3 years, we're obviously going to see the impact of technology particularly around cybersecurity, AI, and what that's going to unfold. But in essence, it's to provide a couple of things. One is, the primary care of any government is to take care of their citizens, whether that's their data, their healthcare, their well-being, and at the same time, growing in the digital economy, they need to attract foreign direct investment. So fundamentally, it's starting to put a little bit of structure on this journey around the physical security, which would be the 5 layers, and we can talk about that later on in detail, and around cybersecurity. And when we talk about cybersecurity, we think of data center. And from our side, we traditionally provide the environment, the physical environment, the power, the cooling, the compute, the network. When we're talking about regulation, it's really focused on the data and the data set. And data has gravity, although it sits in storage, it is mobile, and once it goes mobile, we have to protect that data if that data is sensitive to individuals, whether it's their privacy, healthcare, finance, whether it's data that's created in Saudi, and we protect the sovereignty of that data. It's putting some structure and regulations around the movement, the mobility of that data. It must stay within the kingdom. Now that brings us into an area that I'm sure the panel will talk about as they're building cloud services infrastructure. They have to find a balance between protecting the citizens' data and privacy, like GDPR, or similar to that, and facilitating commerce from a technical and commercial standpoint, that data can actually flow. When we think about the large hyperscale providers like Google or Microsoft or Oracle, their fundamental business is providing software services, whether that's PaaS, platform as a service, infrastructure, or software as a service. In order then, to engage in commerce, data needs to move around because data in itself is quite rich and it provides value.
Yeah, thank you. What's your perception on this as well? I mean, how do you perceive the new regulations? How do you compare some of these maturity in terms of business with some light where things are in terms of maturity and what Saudi is trying and really anxiously trying to do and how to see this.
I think we spoke about this very briefly in our session outside. The way I see it, Saudi is a teenager that's just willing to really get going as quickly as possible. And the ambition is clear from Vision 2030. And these regulations are, as my colleague Colm has just put it, is an upgrade to the ones that came out in 2020. They provide the guidelines to achieve Vision 2030 in terms of data security. We've got more transparency in terms of auditing, physical security. There is also a link to international standards, ISO, the Uptime Institute, mentioned a few, which are quite important as well. But finally, I think it comes down to the difference between an infrastructure provider and who's actually going to be storing services in data centers and providing processing services. So when it comes down to that, the regulation is probably lagging behind the West, but there is a clear drive in Saudi to catch up and connect to the world. The way I see it, and I think even CST and MCIT are quite clear on this, is they want Saudi to be the go-between between Europe, Asia, and the world. Now to get there, from a sovereignty perspective, there is a lot of work to be done between intergovernmental entities, but also when it comes to processing of hyperscalers or even AI computing, especially if it's going to be processed for Saudi and keeping local data secure is great, but also when it comes to the commercial transactions that Colm mentioned, those are going to be flowing into and out of Saudi. There's some work, there's a lot of hard work going on in that space, and I think in the 2-3 years timeline that they've set, we're going to see a lot of, and Stuart mentioned as well, the broken ground. There's going to be a lot of campuses coming up that are going to need some sort of boundaries to work within, because the customers or the tenants who are going to be in those data centers are going to need this. So I think it's a journey. I think it's quite an exciting journey. As I said, it's a teenager just about to go into Manby, as you put it as well. And yeah, watch this space, because I think the evolution is going to come quick and we've got to embrace it.
So I'm conscious that we shouldn't stifle an industry that's just barely coming out of the ground before it's becoming mature. And Saudi is still a very immature market when it comes to data center campuses, when it comes to operators delivering at scale for those customers that we're trying to supply or give supply to for the next 3 to 5 years. The regulations that came out in January this year were very vague. They looked at how to protect the user, they looked at how to encourage more investment, and they looked at how you can engage with third-party security providers to make your campus, your data more secure. So because they're that vague, it means that there is a lot of room for the regulator to ensure that what we do over the next 3 to 5 years, we make sure that we don't stifle the teenager, as my fellow panelist has just made reference to. But as an operator, we are complicit with regulations. We have to register ourselves as a data center. We have to register what tier classification we are, and that's pretty much where it stops for us right now. We don't regulate data because we don't control the data. We don't control the way that the customer transacts its data across its data centers itself. So for us, it's still pretty loose in terms of the next wave of regulations. But I think the MCRT and CST are thinking about it, and they're thinking about it in the right way. I'm just not sure what the next round of regulations are going to cover and how it will benefit the industry at this point in time.
Thank you, Stuart. I mean, just coming back, I mean, as you see and as you all mentioned, we feel it's more of a journey of maturity that CST and the regulator is really trying to take the data center business into. Having touched on that, I mean, in your minds, I think there are many question marks, right? So I'd love really to hear your question marks on these regulations, because I'm sure that CST will eventually answer all of these. I mean, but for you as industry experts, what you would love to see answered and how impactful that would be to the industry itself and to the evolution of the data center business at all different levels. So I'll start with you, Colm, on this.
I think they could take a leaf out of the strengths of other global systems. So when we think of Saudi going through the Vision 2030 and its journey, probably away from hydrocarbons into the digital future or the digital transformation, there are two fundamental areas that need to be addressed. One is localization and the second one is globalization. So when we think of cloud infrastructure and cloud services, we fundamentally have three different types of cloud. So we have public, we have hybrid, and we have private. I think the government on the private side speaks for itself. This is focused on security, finance, citizens, and how the government operates from a governance standpoint. I think the area of cloud and hybrid and public is where it gets a little bit more complex. And it's not unique, to be grappling with these. And Stuart says, we don't know yet what it's going to look like. If you want to operate as a local player, that's going to give you a certain set of rules. And as a global player, you have to follow international standards. We embrace this in Europe, for example, under GDPR. We see Ireland, for example, as a landing hub for data. We see Saudi on a similar journey. It will generate, or it will be a landing point or a hub that will connect the West to the East. So you can imagine data flowing up into Europe, back across to the US, or down into APAC. You need that free movement of data. So however, it needs to have regulation around it, and it also needs to have ownership, accountability, and responsibility. So there is going to be an onus on the cloud infrastructures to protect that data and protect their citizens. So we have no choice. But it's finding the balance that the regulation doesn't put a stranglehold on the free movement of data, and at the same time, as you talked about, sovereignty and safe harbor, that data that should remain here does remain here. How that's going to be executed is a big challenge for my two colleagues on the left, because they provide the infrastructure but may not necessarily own the data sets or the IT infrastructure that resides in their facilities and their environment. That's going to be a continuous challenge. But that challenge is not unique to Saudi. Everybody has the same challenge.
Just to add to that, so when you bring data, so one of the benefits that Saudi has is cheap power. So we are working with a number of customers that want to, and I'll make reference to AI. Look at these large language models that are now coming into the kingdom because we've got cheap power, 4 or 5 US cents per kilowatt hour. You're combining local data with international data. So how does the regulator look at how it governs that data staying in the country? That's a big question for us because you're taking local knowledge, you're taking local data, you're combining it with external data, international data, and you're producing these large language models, training, whatever you want to call them, and then you're exporting them back out of the country. Because that data is effectively coming here because that power is so cheap, because it's more effective for these customers to do that in Saudi Arabia. And then you've got all of the data that's currently out of the country that can't come into the country because there's just no facilities to be able to host it at that scale as such at the moment, because they're looking at using NVIDIA GPUs, which they're using in the US. So it's a minefield, and combining data from multiple geographies and then exporting it out. How do you govern? How do you regulate?
I think Stuart raises a very critical and important question about data, particularly around AI. Right now, we're seeing Saudi as on a kind of embryonic infancy on a journey where it's learning fast and maybe even failing fast and course correcting. When we think of AI, I would like people to separate that in their mind with existing data that we have. Fundamentally, 90% of the data that we have today is human-centric data. It's created by enterprises, companies who generate that data. AI brings in a whole added layer of complexity. While we're grappling with trying to figure out how to manage human-centric data, AI then brings in artificial data, and the two fundamental questions which are now being tested in the courts in the US and in Europe is around the ownership of that data and the copyright. So if you were to ask a large language model a question about building a business plan, generates that data, provides it to you, you go off and use it, or that question that you've asked goes back into a data set. Is it yours, or is it owned by whoever owns the large language model? That opens up a minefield around copyright and ownership. And then if there's data, the fundamental principle around GDPR is do no harm. How do you do no harm, and how do you regulate AI? So the can of worms that Stuart just opened, we haven't figured out how to deal with that. We haven't figured out how to deal with that beyond the shores and the boundary of Saudi, and that's something else that we have to grapple with. But the human-centric data versus the AI data is a whole area of uncertainty that we're about to embrace.
Go on, Nishil.
Just to add to that, so the whole transit of data is a great aspect to look at as well, because fundamentally, I think Saudi is strategically positioned to learn from how AI models, how cloud is developed in sort of the West and also the Far East, in terms of how to implement the best policies to connect everything together. So the timeline we spoke about, 3 years, and the discussions that are ongoing in terms of how, Colm just mentioned, how AI is actually governed, it is something we could learn off fairly quickly and implement it as long as this teenager is allowed to operate within those guidelines. So I think there's a great opportunity to use that as well. But it's also embracing the fact that, yes, localization also requires attention to make sure that there's that middle ground. But to Stuart's point as well, let's not start with it, because you want the industry to grow. And just to add to what my colleague said, there's also an infrastructure aspect to add to this, especially for landing data and how it gets transitioned across Saudi, whether it's going east, west, north, or south. There is some work to be done, not just from a regulation perspective, but from an infrastructure perspective as well.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, but we all agree, right? I mean, a certain level of adherence to maturity levels is needed. And I think what the regulator is trying to do basically is to set the grounds and the expectations to maintain certain maturity and certain offering, to ensure that data availability is there, and digital transformation is happening at an overall level in the country. So my question to you would be, if you put yourself in the regulator's shoes, what would be the best formula of first making sure that the governance is there, but there are no prohibitors, inclusiveness of how technology is evolving for Saudi to take a leading role in the region and maybe, meet their ambitious plans when it comes to AI and being an AI hub in the region and potentially globally as well. So Colm, starting with you, what would your best advice be?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think two things you need to do. One is you need to think strategically and act tactically. And what that means in the data space is thinking globally and acting regionally. So it's true, fair and honest to say that there are certain cultural aspects that are built in to society in the Middle East, whether it's KSA, the fundamental laws and principles, whether it's Islamic law or what governs the cultural idiosyncrasies of this country will differ than it might in Turkey or Germany or the United States. I think fundamentally what you have to do is build a set of best practices. I think my colleague used the word guidelines. We have to have clear guidelines that people operate to. And we need two other fundamental principles. One is transparency. And that transparency doesn't mean that it's open for everyone, but it's open for the government to have access to. And then the third pillar is accountability. Is people have to take responsibility for their actions and their behaviour, and they have to account to that. And if the fundamental principle is to do no wrong, then we focus on the positive side that these technologies give us. Because the whole idea is to generate wealth, to generate commerce, to generate GDP and value. And think about the positives. We wouldn't have vaccines or drug creation or even solve mundane problems without these technologies. We have an average population in the region that's quite young with tech-savvy people. Sometimes we need to protect them from themselves, and sometimes mum knows best. And that's no harm, but at the same time, give them the freedom to explore and innovate. But I think providing clear best practice guidelines, I like the concept of reviewing it every 3 years. What was introduced with Cloud First in 2020 may not be suitable, so the GPUs that Stuart talked about weren't thought of, or we didn't think about them back in 2020 or 2019 when those regs came and they were just post-pandemic. And I'm sure if we come back here in 3 years' time, we're going to have something else that maybe there's challenges in cybersecurity, malware, and bad actors in the field, and we have to deal with it.
Nishil, can you share your thoughts on this?
I think Colm has done a very good job in summarising it in three individual buckets. To help with this, my view on the current regulations, transparency is unlocked. There is if you just look at the auditing aspect in terms of how we go about achieving certain SLAs, international standards, I think that's available. I think if you compare to how things are done in, let's say, data center, I'd say clusters like Frankfurt, Virginia, there is an element of new regulation, but that is again based on the cultural difference in those regions and how they wanted to unlock that GDP to drive those local economies. And there are incentives that Saudi also has in place to drive that as well. But it's understanding, and maybe it's already happening, is that collaboration with the GCC to understand how can we develop this as a region, which is unknown, but also it's now interpollinating, I would say, in terms of very fast of taking the best that has happened in other regions to apply to how the cultural fit can happen within Saudi. Now this is a complex way of looking at it, but the good thing is everyone I speak to at government level, they're all tuned into this. They all want this to succeed. So there's a clear drive in terms of we want to get there as Saudi Arabia in terms of being a leader in the technology space, whether it's data centers or the infrastructure, definitely needed, but it's also then how do we process, manage, secure data to serve not just local populations, but the rest of the world. So I think it's smaller steps, and the local aspect is there, but now it's unlocking it for the rest.
Thank you. Yeah, Stuart, do you want to add to that?
I look at things a little bit more simply than this. Clearly there's a desire to regulate, and there's a desire to regulate something. What that something is still unclear. To regulate, you need to understand how you're going to grow, and in my view, you need to set up a steering committee of industry experts that allows you to look at what's gone on before and look at what's visionary for the future. And my question is to you, Amjad, actually. You're a very successful MD of a very successful company here in Saudi Arabia, NourNet. Have you been asked in terms of what you think the regulations should look like for your business for the future?
I think I'm supposed to ask questions in this panel. Yeah, actually no. As I told you, I think there is a piece of maturity here when it comes to the regulator. I don't think they are trying to impose rules and regulations out of the blue. They're just trying to understand the ecosystem, trying to understand the limitations, and they are taking their own mature steps about pushing the maturity levels higher. And my last question to all of you is basically because from the angle that I'm looking at it being a local company, local setup for the past 25 years, I see things outward, from the discussion that we have. Do you really see what's the impact of the regulations that CST is trying to put on attracting foreign investments, especially on the data center business being the enabler of the economy itself? Do you really see this positively? Do you see this negatively? What's your perception on this? How the government can do a better job in fixing this plus keeping that traction?
So if I can answer that, sorry. So from an investment perspective, I think that they're encouraging investors to come in to invest in infrastructure to align with the 2030 vision. I think that's a positive aspect that the government can certainly work towards. It just needs to make sure that you don't end up with an oversaturated market whereby the demand is not there to meet the supply. And that's, I think, a risk, because when you sell a vision of 2030 1.3 gigawatts, that is a huge hill for the kingdom to climb in the next 7 years or so. So I think there's a positive, but it has to be dealt with in a way that's realistic. Now, if we look at what is on-prem within currently within Saudi, if we look at what all the ministries have in terms of can they put it to a third-party co-location data center, I think they can get to that 2030 vision. So therefore, the investment and the vision of that investment is the right way forward. But it just needs to make sure that it does it in a confined way, in my view.
Yeah, I would add to that is that we should encourage what we call best-in-class hyperscale or leading cloud providers. We know them as Google or Microsoft or Oracle or AWS. We should encourage them to come in to the region. I hold a slightly different view with regard to Stuart on what that means for Saudi. And again, I would take the macro and the micro view. It should enable the digital transformation within the kingdom and facilitate them. At the same time, the cloud providers have to take, as I said earlier on, accountability on the infrastructure that they provide. But if you look at all of the data, there is a lot, it's something like 1.5 gigawatts of in-flight, under construction data center capacity. That data will not be consumed here. That will be used elsewhere. So embracing that cloud, but when you bring them in, it's under the local rules. We use the phrase, when in Rome, do as the Romans, when in Saudi, do as the Saudis. However, at the same time, you can't strangle that because you need to take their technology and use it. But there is the acceptance, albeit not great words of wisdom, that data is the new oil. The difference is data is infinite, whereas oil may be finite. But using that data to your advantage, taking the strategic position, and because of the capability and investment, there is a great opportunity for Saudi to become the hub. And the final point I would say is when you think about what the local resources, whether it's the ability or the capital or the wherewithal to invest. When you think about the cost of energy, why would Saudi not become the training, machine learning, AI facility for Europe? The grid in Europe is 40 to 60 years old. It was built after the Second World War. It doesn't have the energy or the power, and it takes 16 years to get new connections. Where Saudi have the ability to do that, so it can offer that, but it will bring in international connectivity. And the last thing I would say is, when we originally talked about security in data centers, we had 5 layers of security, which were physical security. And these guys will tell you what they are, but fundamentally protecting from the perimeter right down to the server. Nobody breaks into a data center climbing over the gate or the fence anymore. They break into the fiber. So we have to figure out how do we protect that connectivity, both local connectivity and international connectivity. And that means thinking outside the box and being innovative.
Nishil.
From an investment perspective, just to address the initial question you had, I think there's a clear drive with Vision 2030 to attract those global players, hence why a lot of us are sat here today. In addition to that, there is the parallel arm or trajectory, I'm calling it, where the hyperscalers are in conversations with the Saudi government to develop the data processing requirements so that they can transition data in and out of Saudi. So that there is that happening from a regulation perspective. From a power perspective, I think Colm is spot on. Saudi's got the power available. They have the capacity to support processing of AI, which consumes majority of the power. In Europe, you look at a connection in some places, grid upgrade, you mentioned 16 years, but even to get a connection could take 3 to 4 years. Your development's at a standstill until you actually get there, whereas here you could probably get it in a better timeline to actually start your development and phase it out. I suppose then from a connectivity perspective, and this was the important bit that I was thinking about earlier today, is we have a number of subsea cables and landing stations that come in and out of Saudi. There is that aspect of how that landing data works, but also the physical infrastructure in terms of how do we develop this, because at the moment, if you look at connectivity between the Red Sea, that's non-existent. But once that gets unlocked, there is a potential to connect even quicker to the rest of the world as well. So it's not that the regulations, in my view, are guideline. They're clearly linked to Vision 2030, and there's a clear link to drive local and global investment. But now it's the next phase of it in terms of we've done the storming phase. When you start performing, this is a project life cycle. We need to start thinking about how is this actually going to work, because one of my colleagues mentioned it, we need to drive the demand. The demand's got to come in for this infrastructure, the 1.3 gigawatts, to actually deliver on these promises.
Thank you, Nishil. I think we have 5 minutes remaining, so we want to open the stage for questions and answers. Anyone who has a question to any of the panelists, please. We have 2 questions here.
Nishil speaks about the lacking in regulations. How can we in Saudi Arabia benefit from this lagging? Because in Europe, especially, there is a lot of restrictions on PUEs, WEs, whatever XUEs. So instead we don't have this one. So how can we benefit from this?
I think it's a great question where I like to use the term we should be a fast follower. So the things that are hindering progress in the West are the things that we should use to unlock in this region. To your point on PUE and WE, you probably get your XUE, etc. I think those are industry standards that are assessed that you assess your performance against. Those will come anyway. That is more of how efficient are we in terms of sustainability. But to your point and to what I was saying is, let's follow fast. Whatever hasn't worked out there, we should improve on it, not to stifle it, but to embrace it, to actually unlock it, to develop and catch up.
And if I could add to that, if you think of the regulation that they have in Europe, Europe is now leading the way. So I would take the positives from the Western side. When we talk about CSRD, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, this is where we're forcing companies to take responsibility to protect the planet so that we don't just take advantage of it today and forget about tomorrow. When we look at the CUE and WE and PUE, that's focused primarily on sustainability. Fundamentally though, there are three things you need to look at. In order to develop commerce and security, you must secure energy security, then that leads to economic security, and that will lead to environmental security. It only comes that way. The instability that we've seen in the energy world has tipped things off its axis. When we think of PUE, power utilization, there's a lot of research going into what the next power sources would look like, whether that's hydrogen, even SMR, small modular reactors. When we look at that, we have to think of MUE, money utilization effectiveness. Let's not lose sight of this. This is a commercial business. This is about making money. But we should take advantage of that, and we should have transparency by reporting these metrics. And what that does is it drives best in class. And the final example I will give you, if you look what happened in Germany, they've set a PUE of 1.2. That PUE of 1.2 is a coded message to anybody who wants to build in Germany. Do not build air-cooled data centers. They have to be liquid-cooled because they're more efficient, they're more effective, and they're a better use of power. So I think we take the positive.
I just wanted to add one more thing to what you said, because I actually came out of working in Germany. You're spot on. And the example to that was, got liquid cooled, but actually you don't have wood supply to support the liquid cooling. So you've got to think of other ways to innovate, other ways to develop further as well, to try and drive your PUE efficiency as well. Again, that's a constraint, but again, the positives are, look, there's a target set. We have a target of 1.3 gigawatts here. Yes, it's a challenging target, but they need to be up there to try and get something.
Thank you. I think so. I mean, in short, the answer to your question is there are no rules now, but I mean, gradually there will be rules implemented. I think we're running out of time. Can we accept any additional questions? We're done. Thank you so much. Gentlemen, we can have it later on. I mean, a special thanks to all my panelists, and thank you for your participation and patience.